Can't see anything here.
Hello all, good afternoon. Hope you can all hear me. So yes, we're here to have this discussion called The Naked Truth, and we're basically generally going to be looking at art and pornography in various guises. We have a very interesting and amazing panel. To my far left, we have Griselda Pollock, one of the country's leading art historians. Griselda's works include Visions and Difference and Looking Back to the Future. She is currently director for cultural analysis, theory and history at the University of Leeds, and she's also a living legend in my opinion. So next to her we have Hans Mays. Hans graduated from the University of Leuven, Belgium, with a PhD in philosophy. His dissertation, focusing on the problems of ethics and moral psychology, was published as a book in Belgium and the Netherlands. He has since made aesthetics and philosophy of art the main focus of his postdoctoral activities. He is currently a member of the Aesthetics Research Group and is a lecturer of history and philosophy in art for the University of Kent. Next to Hans, we have Patricia Ellis. Patricia is building on her long work with the Saatchi Gallery. Patricia is the author of 100, the works that changed art. She's a curator, freelance writer, and has curated over 11 exhibitions in the last decade. I'll say no more on that one. And next to me, we have Martin Kemp. Martin is a leading expert on the work of Leonardo and the art of science and light. He's Oxford-based art historian. Martin has curated for the V&A, the Barbican and Hayward Galleries. His new book is From Christ to Coke.
And from Christ to Coke.
That's right.
I battled that with the publisher.
Very precise in these things. And Griselda also asked me to mention that many of her new publications which have come out of her research department at Leeds are available in the Blackwell's bookstore, so do check those out. So I think you all know the format for these talks. Each speaker is given roughly 4 minutes to respond to the question, and after that we'll have a little mini debate between us, and then we'll open it out to the audience. I'll be extremely strict on the timings and all other things, and we're going to start with Martin. And so the idea is to respond to the question: can artistic depictions of the body make us more aware of our physical being in the world? So, Martin.
Thank you. I think probably the first thing to say is woof. I've not had a dog commenting before, but anyway, this is the first time for everything. My job here, in a sense, is as a historian of old things, as well as new things, and also an old historian, is to start off and make things very messy and contextual. And the other people can then bring crystal clarity into these definitions. By complex and contextual, let me begin with some examples of male nudes, because this discussion often tends to center upon female nudity. An example which I've looked at and come across is the Michelangelo Christ in Santa Maria Maggiore, with the symbols of the Passion originally naked. It was given a perizonium, a loincloth at an early stage, was then restored, very well restored recently. The perizonium came off and it's now back on. Now the reason why Christ is shown nude is because Christ came down and was incarnate. He was enfleshed, he was put in a body. That's part of the point of showing him as a man, fully equipped as such. So there's, between the original iconography and how it is then read and what is done with it, is a very complex contextual thing. And of course, there's the famous case of the Michelangelo David in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was provided, whether for Queen Victoria or somebody else, was provided with a fig leaf at one point, which it didn't have in Florence. So how these things are seen and the eyes we bring to bear on them are incredibly complicated. That, I think, is where, in a way, I try to differentiate art and pornography, not as absolute definitions, but in terms of openness of reading and intentional closed reading, though obviously pornography can be read much more, much more openly. The pornographer's job is to arouse. Anything that complicates that unduly gets in the way of that job, such as very subtle, ambiguous psychological communications, subtle narratives. gets in the way of that. And I'm talking about absolutely mainstream, solid commercial pornography, not about some of the more openly artistic sort of postmodern pornography. On the other hand, a work of art is, you're not trying to prescribe reading. You obviously have a reading which you've got in mind, but it's an open field. Art is essentially generous, fluid, and you can't nail it down in that way. But you can obviously bring an image from pornography, as we did in the Hayward Gallery show, Seduced, into an art gallery, and it then is subject to different reading. Both the pornographic image and someone like Marlene Dumas, who does very extraordinary watercolors based upon pornographic images off the web. So I would say it's incredibly complex, slippery, and difficult. But for me, there is a core of difference in function and intention in that old-fashioned way between art and pornography, though it becomes very woolly in a whole series of different contexts.
Thank you very much. Patty, do you want to?
Yeah, this question is really tricky, and I started to think about it from way too many angles, I think. But for me, I think there's a real part of the issue, I think, is sort of thinking about art in terms of porn, or even in terms of this idea of nudity in terms of arousal. I mean, I for one, I've never walked into an art gallery and gone schwing. I don't think art has that kind of capability, and I think a lot of that has everything to do with image. And quite a lot of what Martin was saying is that art has, it has a conceptual slippage where porn is like it's very direct, it's totally unmediated. In a lot of ways, I'm trying to think, if that was possible in art, how awesome would that be? But I can't actually think of an artwork which can actually provide that kind of instantaneous, kind of immediate sub-thought, sub-language kind of idea. Instead, how I started to think about it instead was sort of more, how do we actually experience an idea of porn, or what actually makes something erotic? And I think a lot of times that has a lot to do with voyeurism and this kind of concept of looking. And if you think about how porn works, it very much is, image, very basic description. I mean, it's basically, picture of people boinking. Yeah, and that's like, it's just that quite direct, but there's somehow something ultimately, utterly compelling in that. If you think about, I guess, how we look at contemporary art, because that's not what I'm particularly interested in, is this idea of, one, that something could be erotic, which I haven't actually seen an erotic piece of art in a long time. Something could be shocking. I haven't seen something that's been shocking in an extremely long time. Instead, what I sort of feel is that what becomes mostly shocking about it is how we start to look at art and why it stops to have those kind of factors anymore. And I think a lot of it has to do with our viewing experience today is something which is very much based on media. We are very much mediated through screen mentality. We look at images on TV, we look at JPEGs, we are constantly bombarded with information. And so when you actually go into an art gallery and you're looking at a painting, I find more often than not people are looking at paintings perhaps more as image, perhaps more as a flat, still thing that should be somehow fixated, focused upon, instead of actually thinking about it in terms of its medium and the idea of that being a painting within itself. And if you look at the artworks which have tended to capture the public's imagination, the works that have become most popular in media are the kind of proper, porn, I guess, of the art world. I mean, it tends to be things which are, very, very easy to get, things which are almost like quite stupid in their inception. And, this idea that once that a gaze would be something which is quite, sexually directed. I mean, today, in context of, say, YouTube culture, is something which has independent multiplicities. I mean, there are as many different brands of porn as there are individuals in the world. I mean, everybody has their own personal subjectivity when looking at images. And the thing in terms of art and trying to actually capture something which becomes extremely popular, so captures that kind of mass swing factor. And when you look at it in terms of other things that happen in culture, that kind of eroticism becomes the most banal thing that you can possibly think of. So in a lot of ways, something like Tracy Emin's bed is like the most banal thing I can possibly think of. But in popular culture, the equivalent of that would be something like, the most thing that gets hit most on the internet is like the YouTube kittens or something like this, where it's almost like the dumbest thing that that becomes our porn. So it's almost become this idea that porn becomes anti-sex. It becomes something about the total boredom of looking, something that becomes about the complete utter banality of culture, which I think is something which is really quite far removed from an idea of physicality. And also it starts to think sort of maybe really question the notion of, why do we think about art or have these expectations of art in the first place, but more that, does art actually sit separate from our experience of voyeurism, separate from our experience of viewing, and perhaps it exists something as purely conceptual and doesn't have anything to do with the visual, if that makes sense. The best art's perhaps the headfuck of the conceptual.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so maybe let me continue the theme of art and pornography, and maybe say something about pornographic representations before then coming back to the topic of artistic representation. So a pornographic representation I take to be a representation that is sexually explicit and that is meant to be sexually arousing. I think that's pretty much like a good definition of what pornography is, or what we understand by pornography. Now, if the question is, so can pornographic representations make us more aware of our bodily beings, then I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. That's exactly what they're meant to do. They're meant to be arousing, and they're meant to do something to you physically. Further, you could ask the question, well, can pornography have an impact on your views and your attitudes towards your body? Then again, I think the answer is quite obviously yes. That's why so many people are opposed to pornography and protest against pornography under the banner of pornification. That's what people find so objectionable, is that our society is bombarded with these images and is influenced by them, and it changes the way people look at their bodies, experience their bodies, what they think is the correct way to dress or to have sex, etc. Now, so if you're looking at pornographic representations, I think the answer to that question, whether they can make us more aware of our bodies, is definitely yes. So let's think about artistic representation. And I want you to imagine the following. Can you imagine that there's a subcategory of pornographic representations that we could possibly call artistic, that could have artistic merit? Maybe because they do what pornography does, they are sexually arousing, but not in a crude and vulgar and superficial way, but in a subtle way, in a profound way, in a sophisticated way. So can you imagine that? Can you imagine, is it possible, you think, that there's a subcategory of pornographic representations that influences the way we think about our bodies, the awareness we have of our bodies, not in a negative way, but in a positive way? Maybe by making us understand certain things that we didn't understand before, by giving us sort of a knowledge of what it is like to engage in this or that sort of sexual experience, something we didn't know before. So can you imagine that? Do you think that is possible? Well, that's what I've been doing research on like the last year, so to speak. The reasons for thinking that there is such a thing as pornographic art, something that combines the two aspects, is pornographic, sexually explicit, meant to be arousing, but has artistic merit as well, maybe along the lines that I've just suggested. And the conclusion I've reached is that I don't think there is a good reason at all to say that pornography and art are mutually exclusive, that they're inherently incompatible. I think they are compatible. I think there can be such a subcategory. And what is more, that's the last thing I'll say for now, is there are not too many of these works around already. So only a handful of masterpieces, I think, that we could qualify as pornographic art. But there could be more of them, and I think there should be more of them. Because, I mean, sex is an important part of human life. It's a very intense experience, can be life-changing, and we've left it to the porn industry. And so my idea would be, like, it would be nice if artists could really get involved and engage with it, and that's something I would look forward to.
Thank you.
Wow, I tried very hard not to be on this panel because I thought the subject was so sort of scary and huge and complicated, and all of my kind of academic training would find me saying, wait a minute here, let's do some definitions. The body, okay? Well, one of the great things that feminism and anti-racism and queer theory has gone about saying is there's no such thing as the body. There's my body, your body, his body, her body, black bodies, white bodies, queer bodies, straight bodies, old bodies, pregnant bodies, disabled bodies, arthritic bodies. You know, we've made a huge development in the last 30, 40 years to really think embodiment. Secondly, of course, I come from a certain kind of psychoanalytical tradition which says actually it's all in the mind. Your physical body is nothing compared to the way we imagine it. We have patterned our bodies from the moment of birth to be sites of orality. We have made our eyes erotic organs that go because, babies have eyesight far before they have any sense of being able to do anything in the world. Tactility, we have skin surfaces, and we are eroticized through very extraordinary processes through infancy and the interaction with nourishment and ultimately with autoeroticism. So what is the psychoanalytical body? So if you draw a picture of the psychoanalytical body, you have a huge mouth, you have huge eyes, and you have relatively tiny organs, which are, in a sense, surfaces to be stimulated, not things to be done with. So we've got this whole kind of baseline of this particular area. And then, of course, we're talking about representations. And the question came to me was, when did the body enter into the human imagination? Why did you represent the body? And of course, ancient representations are not of bodies. They're of trees, they're of animals, dogs, thank you very much. Horses, cattle, and the most ancient things. And the figure is a figure, as we know, in movement, not a sexual figure. And the arrival of the sort of fully blown figurations of the great Hindu traditions or the classical traditions are based on military bodies. Greek art is about the celebration of masculinity because this is a militarized body, nakedness. Female nudity doesn't arrive in Greek art until very, very late and is associated with cults of beauty, cults of the power of the body. We still don't fully understand the ancient meanings of the bodies of past times. And when the first book on studying the nude in Western art came out in 1956, in fact, it seems like with Kenneth Clark, what was very interesting is that he classified all the different ways in which Western art had dealt with the body, and we had Apollo, which is the body of self-mastery. He's upright, he can command the world. His lower body is, as it were, small, contained, and subject to his intellectual and physical prowess as a master of the universe. And then you have Venus, who is obviously a sexualized body, but women are just so lumpy and horrible, we have to idealize her. So the celestial Venus. And then the other one with the sort of sagging breasts and bloated stomach is called vegetable. That's Kenneth Clark's. But then what I found very interesting is he classifies the body as being capable of representing these different imaginations, the imagination of pathos, of energy and ecstasy. And if you classify that in the chapter on pathos, the male nude dominates. There are 36 images because, going back to Martin's point, the great image of the Western tradition of the pathos of the body suffering, is Christ on the cross. And there are very few female bodies that represent suffering. And yet, of course, the female body is the site of excruciating suffering, the image, partly in childbirth. Energy, 37. Hercules, powerful male body. You don't have energetic female bodies. If you do, they're ecstatic, they're out of their mind. Right, so the maenad, and we get to category ecstasy, 19 female bodies, 7 male bodies. So we've got already a kind of, a cultural discourse as to what do our bodies represent for us. And I find this is what I'm really very fascinated by, is not only going back to the sexual body. It does seem to me absolutely to be analyzed why on earth we're living in an era where we think that representing people doing sex, I suppose it's just people don't know how to do it, so they have to be shown constantly. Whereas, in fact, some of the greatest works about eroticism are the things which don't show it, because, in sense, eroticism is in the mind, it's in the hand, it's in a different kind of place, and it's a fantasy area. So some of the most profoundly erotic films I've ever seen have nothing to do with mechanics. We call it ice cream in our house, because when it came on television, we'd all say to the kids, "Oh, I think it's ice cream time." But last night I was watching television So they think, God knows what they do. I don't ask, of course, what my children do. But I was watching television, The Joys of Teen Sex. I don't know if anybody watches some of these really fascinating programs now, which, of course, where all the young guys said that they're all watching pornography and now asking their girlfriends to have anal sex. And then they interviewed a porn star who said, oh, well, you know, we do anal sex, but I starve myself for 10 days, you know, I never have anything, you know, I have enemas, I goodness knows what, etc. Well, all these kids are having anal sex with, forgetting about all the things that go with it. But it is where, you know, pornography is now teaching people what they should do, which may be very pleasurable, whatever, but it's nothing to do with actually asking the great question we as feminists ask, which is, where does sexual pleasure come from? Who owns it? What pleasure, you know, what would be my pleasure? And I still think the condition is of knowledge about female sexuality and the nature of the female body as a site of pathos or ecstasy is very interesting and important. But the final thing I want to talk about, which is that I work particularly on the issue of genocide and trauma and horror, a very comforting alternative to our sexual pleasure aspect of it. But I would just want to put in the view, which is what has happened to the body and the representation of the body, given the atrocity of what was done to it in reality. And my view, in some sense, is the whole tradition of Western art, in which the body could be a kind of ideal mirror of various images we have of ourselves or aspirations, whether as erotic beings or beings of suffering or beings of energy, ecstasy, or even intellect, are somehow brutally ruptured by the reality of what we did and what we saw, and that the discourse of the body has changed. And part of the present fascination with sexuality and the loss of some of the complexity in the representations of the body and art of the past is our a kind of compulsive and post-traumatic rejection, a failure to recognize the vulnerability, the fragility of the body. And I work with an Italian philosopher, Adriana Cavarero, who's talking now about the new nature of violence that we inflict on the body through suicide bombings, through the kind of fragility of the human body that has been exposed to such horrific violence. And I would like to see that part of the discourse on the body and a kind of clothing of nakedness. I've got the four works of Bracha Ettinger that I've been talking about are upstairs. I'm going to stop. Actually, are about how to clothe that nakedness in something of the aesthetic access to pathos rather than to voyeurism. Or
Way over time.
Okay.
Fantastically interesting, but 2 minutes over. Jesus. But okay. Thank you, Fleet. Thank you. Okay. So how should we all respond to that? I don't know if you all have any initial responses that you want to just come back with immediately? Anybody? Or shall I insert a question?
I have one point in relation to Hans and one in relation to Griselda, and this is not discriminatory, but it's just how it's panned out. Hans, you said there's no good reason from the point of view of philosopher why there cannot be good, instructive, artistic pornography. Now, what you didn't say, whether in practice this can actually be accomplished given the sort of classificatory modes we have at looking at art and pornography.
Yeah. Is this microphone still on?
Yeah.
Sounds like it.
Okay. Yes, that is a good question. The author Alan Moore once said, or compared pornography to adolescent poetry. He said it's very easy to do, but it's very hard to do well. And that's absolutely true. I think to make pornography that is truly artistically rewarding is very hard to do. I think Alan Moore is one of the few who has actually succeeded in that and has made a work that qualifies as pornographic art. It's a comic book actually that's called Lost Girls. He made it with his wife Melinda Gebbie, and it's truly a marvelous work. So in response also to a comment that Patricia made was that she couldn't really think of any artwork that does to her or to people in general what a work of pornography does. I think that would be an example. I don't know whether people are familiar with this, but it is I think, a work of pornographic art. So, well, here's an example of someone I think who has succeeded in doing precisely that. Making pornography, it is sexually arousing, it is sexually explicit, but it is more than that. It gives you a complicated story that is in itself interesting, a comment on Germany of the pre-war era. It is about characters that he takes from other fictions, so it is multi-layered in many ways. It's about growing up with female sexuality. All the lead characters are women. I'm just talking about this one particular example because it is an example that I think qualifies as such. But your question was more general, right?
Yeah, it was really, yeah, you can theorize that there is this thing, but then when it's displayed in a context, and you tend to display it in a context, either you think you're looking at pornography or looking at art, and it's very difficult to get a context in which that's blurred. You could probably set up one for viewing what you're talking about, but
I think, if I can just interject, I am thinking about an interview I heard with Jeff Koons, who obviously famously made the Celebration series, which was a pornographic series of works, supposedly, in which he was the main star with his then wife,
Made in Heaven.
And I remember hearing Jeff Koons talk about kitsch in relation to pornography, and he described kitsch as a subject which circles within itself, so it's always about itself and doesn't go beyond itself. And I think the same thing can perhaps be said about pure pornography. Pure pornography circles within itself and isn't really about anything else. And what artwork should do, or good artwork should do, should be to go beyond that subject matter. So I thought I'd just interject that into it. But maybe Griselda had a point as well.
yeah. Well, just to say as a footnote, we had Jeff Koons in the Barbican Art Gallery, and you could look down from the balcony where you saw him on the job to Greek pots. And that did very interesting things to how you perceive Jeff Koons. Griselda's point, I think, is very important about suffering and bodies. What seems to happen in the history of art is that female suffering, martyrdom, is eroticized, as in Bernini, as in Maderno, and the women suffer, but they suffer in a very erotic way, which isn't the kind of blood and guts heroism, the kind of militaristic suffering that male martyrs undergo. So it's transferred into this erotic zone, but I suspect that nobody actually masturbates in front of Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. So it's eroticized, but somehow doesn't function sexually.
But don't you think there's a difference between artworks that attempt to, as it were, bring into the visible, i.e. to the point where we can encounter it, encountering an artwork, some dimension of human experience? So, I mean, Bernini's purpose, obviously, in the St. Teresa, is to find a visual form of representation for a certain sense of the body yielding to something greater than itself. And one of the great debates about that piece is she having a mystic vision? And of course, Desardes said, the point is you can't tell the difference. And you're held, therefore, in your own self, because the place where this is happening is in the viewer. And I think that's where the difference between, seems to me, art and pornography is, art is soliciting you to, not in a sense to be a voyeur, and therefore gain, because voyeurism is to say, I take somebody else as an object, something is happening to them, and I imagine myself doing it, and that excites me. Whereas when you see an artwork, you may be being solicited to say, what is this experience? Do I know it? Can I recognize it? What do I know in myself I can bring to it? And that wonderful undecidability of Bernini is to say, we may have areas of experience which are so close that we confuse them and we don't know, and I will not let you say, don't worry, this is not sexual, this is purely spiritual, the popes can see this and not be aware. I mean, that's what's so brilliant about Bernini, which, as a sculptor, and the power of sculpture is to hold you there, whereas I think pornography has to be defined as that which has a purpose in terms of informing you about sexual positions and arousing something because you see it in a certain way. Now, erotic art or art about the erotic, because you have Japanese traditions, you have Indian traditions, you have China, you have a lot of traditions which are specifically about fostering a certain erotic sensibility that isn't the same as porn. And I think we have to keep a hold on, these the divisions between those sort of places, those operations, because it's the nature of what I'm asked to bring to it or do with it.
Hans, you had a point.
Well, yeah, a quick follow-up. First about the point of Koons. So I think it's worthwhile keeping the following distinction in mind. So you can say, you can have pornographic art that is pornographic in two ways. Pornographic in the weak sense and in the strong sense. Art that is pornographic in the weak sense is art that looks like pornography, it mimics pornography, it refers pornography, it might be about pornography, but it is not pornography. Now, there's a lot of art that is pornographic in the weak sense in contemporary galleries nowadays, and Koons is a great example. It's art that is about pornography, but it's not meant to function as pornography. You're not meant to use it as pornography. And the same is true for the works of Thomas Ruff or John Currin or you name it, people who use sexually explicit images in contemporary art. The interesting category, I think, and the category of which Martin is not wholly sure that it exists, is art that is pornographic in a strong sense. Not just that it mimics pornography, that it looks like pornography, but it actually is pornographic, which means sexually explicit and meant to be arousing. And I think there are works that qualify as such. In answer to Griselda's point is, yes, it's true that pornography has a certain function, but two things. It needn't be limited to that function. It can do more things, and I think a lot of pornography does more than just this one thing. There's a tendency among people who comment on pornography to really undercomplicate the issue often, I think. So they tend to speak of pornography as a very simple thing, whereas I think often it's a very complex thing, and it deals with all the complexities of personhood, and someone has described it as the royal road into the cultural psyche, because it reveals so many things about what's going on in our culture. So that's one thing to note. And another thing to note is that I think that that works of art can have a function. There is religious art that has the function of being a religious icon, and there are many sorts of art that have functions. So in itself, the having of a function doesn't disqualify it from the realm of art necessarily.
No, but I think
Okay,
that if that function is redundant, and that's where I have like artwork which is, I don't think you can actually have art that actually already replicates something which functions, exists quite properly in society. And I think that there's been a lot of contemporary art made this way, whether it's people who make pseudo television documentaries and put them in art galleries. Do they really do anything better than the BBC can do, or are they just kind of replicating an existing format? And this is where I draw the line of where oftentimes things which could be quite explicit imagery, which seem to be like porn, they don't. There has to be some kind of a distinction, or else it's this kind of cultural appropriation of sort of taking, and it happens quite a lot. You do see that, where people will take something that already exists in culture, stick it in a gallery, and it's it's recontextualized. But I mean, I don't think that's necessarily clever.
Fair enough.
Griselda wants to come up as well.
But what do we do with a whole legacy of exploration of the kind of abuses? I mean, I'm thinking of some of the great feminist works like Andrea Dworkin and Susan Griffin. There's a whole literature on the question of pornography, which raised the question of it's not just about I mean, it has a narrative, it has a certain scenario, it does involve sadism, it does involve racism. Now, obviously what people get up to in their sex life is extraordinarily complex, and sexuality is very sort of polymorphous and potentially perverse, but the images of it have this history, and what I'm deeply concerned about is we're just sort of brushing under the carpet a whole series of critiques which do relate to issues of violation, violence, certain ways of seeing people and seeing bodies and instrumentalizing bodies, fantasizing about action. And we're living in a world now which I find quite perplexing, and I don't know whether I think, which is the self-pornographization of women. I mean, many of my students, young students, come and what they want to use feminist theory for is to say, what is happening to our world? How do I have to be, I have to have a Brazilian, I have to do anal sex now, I have to present myself in the world in a model that once was in pornography. So this is seeped out and become normalized. I mean, when my daughter was, I think, 12, she brought home a book, a magazine aimed at it, and I didn't look at it. I thought, I'm going to be very liberal and all the rest of it. But my mother read it and said, do you really want your 12-year-old to know how to give oral sex to her boyfriend? What used to be within the space of pornography, where it was accessed for the purposes of sort of adult sexuality, which is absolutely right and proper, and I'm in no way concerned with issues of censorship in terms of how people... But now it's penetrated into, literally, excuse the word, into our culture, and the notion of femininity that young girls are growing up with is one based on pornography, which doesn't give them access to a sense of sexual identity or other ways of embodiment that is free from this instrumental. It's because it's all about what is good for, in terms of heteronormative sex, young men, their pleasure. And I think we as cultural critics are responsible to think about that. I don't understand how we are just letting it happen under a certain kind of liberalization. Isn't it a problem?
Could we talk about it in terms of not only being a type of sexualization of the female body for men, but also for the purpose of, in the wider sense, the market? There's a kind of literal commodification in terms of financial gain to be had from various markets for
cosmetic surgery all the way through
all of these things. Perhaps Martin wants to come in on that one as well.
No, I was actually going to address a somewhat different thing, sorry, Chair, in relation to what Griselda was saying. Yes, there's very, very powerful work by women about violence towards women's body of all sorts, ranging from sort of dieting to sex. One of the things which has always slightly puzzled me, and it shows how very simple relabeling can actually alter how different the looking is. I talked to the Hayward Gallery at one point about doing an exhibition of John Hilliard. Does very complicated photo works, and some of which are quite edgy in relation to women's bodies. And they said, we're not really prepared to consider this. And I said, if the artist's name was a woman, would you be prepared to consider it? And they got sort of slightly shifty, and one of them said yes. So it shows how even, we can make a very simple move of labeling in an art gallery or an artist's name and so on, and we can invert.
This is almost a question about authorship, actually, and that actually comes back to what Griselda was saying, and also what Patty said in your initial comments. And actually, I want to bring it back to the internet as a form of kind of a place for authors of pornography to participate, and maybe you can talk some more about that.
Well, I was just going to bring up a quick point first, and that I think that there's a real issue with this, how we actually talk about the female body, and that it always seems to somehow revert back to sex because that is an acceptable field to talk about. I mean, if we actually look at the problem with the violence of the female body, the things which actually hinder women within society, I mean, if we were to actually be having this whole discussion about how crap the whole situation for childbirth is, for the progression of your career as a woman, for your entire selfhood, how you're actually socially perceived, half the people in this room would just leave. And the fact that we can only talk about these things in terms of porn, in terms of boob jobs, in terms of dieting, in terms of it's actually quite cosmetic issues, and not actually ever getting to the heart of things. And I think that in terms of the internet, I think that's really in a lot of ways, I think just makes the whole porn argument completely redundant. I mean,
But is there something we've had discussions before, is there something actually positive and creative that the internet has helped to produce, where people can, the phrase that Griselda used earlier, which I like, was the idealised body. And there's something about the idealised body in pornography where for such a long time we've only been presented with this idealised body.
I'm not so certain that there is an idealised body, and everything that you're sort of saying I think really resounded with me anyways, in the sense of, boob jobs, Brazilians, anal sex. I mean, honestly, if you came at your man with a total Brazilian triple F tits and going, hey baby, and he'd probably run like hell. I mean, that's terrifying. It's not an image of reality, and I don't know whose ideal that is. And when you actually look at a lot of the porn on internet, because I actually find one thing about porn that's really interesting is sort of user-made porn, like Craigslist porn, or there's something of a creative element of that, where people have a kind of authorship over that, where they can actually create their own fantasies, and what becomes idealized on the internet perhaps isn't what was traditionally an ideal, although there is an awful lot of the cliche stuff as well.
Could I pick up? Sorry.
Hands first, and then I'll come to you.
Right. Well, I think it's important to keep a distinction in mind, the distinction between what pornography is like, as a matter of fact, nowadays, and what it could possibly be. So I started out by saying that pornography as it is has quite a negative impact on how we think about our bodies and about our beings, ourselves as sexual beings. So I fully agree with Griselda's point and with Patricia's point as well, that it can have this impact, and certainly the internet is a factor in that as well. But I also wanted to take it a step further and say, well, if pornography can influence the way we think about our bodies, these representations can do that, then wouldn't it be great if artists would enter that domain and start making pornography that doesn't do that anymore, that doesn't, let's say, eroticize relations of inequality, that doesn't give you depictions and representations that are objectifying, exploitative, but instead maybe
But I don't think porn's done that for a long time. I think it's quite, if anything, it's self-objectifying or self-exploitative. If you think of something like chat roulette, I mean, that is, people people broadcast themselves. People create their own fantasies, and there are power structures within that. But I don't think it's not an oppressive, subjective issue. I mean, a lot of it is self-control. And I don't think that, for artists, I mean, how could an artist ever create anything more genuine or more direct or more pornographic than that already?
And I think that's partly what Griselda was saying, is that these people who enter these chat roulettes and make their own porn films that are just as exploitative and objectifying as mainstream pornography, they're influenced by what they've seen so far. So the issue comes up of trying to counteract this. And the only thing I want to say is that is possible. And maybe if I
But
could
it's
add,
like counteracting and saving people from themselves, though. I mean, I find that there's a real moral, ethical thing, a hierarchy thing happening there, which I find very weird.
Okay, Martin had a point as well.
Yeah, one of the interesting things on the internet, and Hans has touched on this, is sort of amateur webcamming and so on, which is a complete genre of its own now. And there you've got, for me, a somewhat better chance of arousal because it is ordinary people. And I put in ordinary in inverted commas, because of course a porn star is an ordinary person at the end of the day. But those websites, often the people who are performing on them, actually are enacting these porn scenarios which they've seen. So one of the questions you asked was, how far is life imitating art? And in that case, whether you consider the porn art, nonetheless you get a style of sex occurring there with the amateur, which is on a webcam, which is a strange kind of reduced version of something which they've got an idea that's what you do. So there's a very complex dialogue going on there between art, pornography, and somebody doing something semi-spontaneously on a webcam.
I remember Malcolm McLaren always used to use the term karaoke culture. He was obsessed with the idea that we lived in this kind of karaoke culture, and I think that even the kind of DIY porn on the internet is a kind of form of karaoke porn in a way, people copying it. But the point I wanted to make about the internet, in that I think there's some kind of freedom it's allowed, and almost a kind of creativity for people who are not artists, but they get to use the internet to explore their imaginations and their sexual imaginations in probably ways that they couldn't before. So I think that that may be some kind of perhaps a positive side to it. I don't know if anyone wants to come back to any of that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's a fact of life, and it is a form of communication, and it should be studied as a form of communication, social networking, exchange, and all the rest of it. But I mean, we are just thinking here, in some sense, is there a specificity to what art asks of us, which does involve some, double knowledge of, whenever you make an artwork in the presence of other artworks. You make an artwork in the presence of something which is questioning you, right? So I mean, since anybody doing something on the internet never has to ask, is it the first thing, the new or the different? It just has to say, I want to make it and I want to share it. And that's fine, but we mustn't confuse that with everybody suddenly become an artist because they can make an image. And obviously, I mean, in one sense, pornography may have some very brilliant people working in it, but it's fundamentally an industrially based, profit-oriented thing with people working. That's why I was saying about, what the porn stars do to, and the conditions under which porn gets made has been historically one of the definitions of what it is, and it's also something that is defined by the law. Pornography is constituted by the law saying this can be, and, you can show this, you can't show this, we've got obscenity, we change it. Whereas art is actually operating in a different space, and it can engage with the nature of embodiment, the nature of our experiences, and that's why I want to make sure we don't lose the nature of pathos, of compassion, of our sense of responsibility to other people. And the pornographic is oriented towards one thing, pleasure, and it's the pleasure of the person who is either identifies with the doing or perhaps masochistically identifies with the done to, but the erotic, the eros the word eros is to do with connection. It's somewhere else, and I would hope that we can make a distinction that which art, there is a space for certain artistic practices which are not mechanically explicit, but expand our sense of where the erotic desire for connection, which may be sexual, can be used in other ways for fostering a different kind of, humanity, basically, in the sense.
I did think at one point, in relation to sort of amateur webcamming activity, what could you do with that as a work of art? And I'm not an artist, but I thought it would be interesting to have it starting very voyeuristically, very exhibitionistically, and gradually seeing it breaking down, so the person undergoes some kind of different emotional experience.
I can just do a quick plug. There's a book in the bookshop called Digital and Other Virtualities, Renegotiating an Image, which has an essay by Adrian Rivkin on an artist whose name is David something, who did this really brilliant queer piece around taking things that are exchanged in a chat room, so quite explicit and sort of fostering things, but he enacts them, so you actually see somebody saying them. And it's the most extraordinarily interesting artwork because the alteration that results from literally making a kind of, they're never in the same room, but as if they were actually saying this to each other, alters radically, the level of the discourse that can happen in the chat room, and forces you to think, what is this, and what happens when they come together? So I think there's an example of exactly what you're saying.
That's why I'm a historian, not an artist. I'm always behind the pace. Yeah.
I guess, go on if you've got a point.
Very, very quickly. So, pointing to a danger that that might be attached to drawing the line in that strict way between art and pornography. The danger might be that if there is an artist who moves in the direction of the pornographic and not the erotic, so eros comes from the Greek word of love and passion. But there's a lot of art that doesn't deal with, let's say, loving relations between people and can be very explicit. Now, the danger is that you mentioned censorship laws and all these things, that these artists will be censored, will be called pornographers, and we lose the valuable things that they do. I think of people like Mapplethorpe or Oshima, the director who created In the Realm of the Senses. The works of these artists is very explicit. You cannot really call it erotic in that gentle sense. So what do we call it?
No, I'm not saying, no, erotic isn't gentle and loving. Eros is connection. Eros isn't love and, it's not about something nice. So, but Oshima is right, because, we can be taken to very, very extreme areas of human experience that we may not wish even to have to go to or to explore, but it's done within the beauty of an incredibly finely structured, narratively constructed, durational, cinematographically, the whole effect is to take you to a level of sort of shocking experience and understanding of human potentiality, not simply to put you back in a place of simple using an image for the purposes of sexual arousal. I think so. That would.
Okay, I just want to maybe bring up one other point, and then maybe we'll start to ask some questions from the audience. The thing that I'm thinking about kind of thing is, even the fact that we're even having this conversation, if and there's something about pornography which is a sign of liberalism and freedom of expression and freedom generally. And if we were in, other parts of the world, we wouldn't even be able to have this conversation, and certainly we wouldn't be able to release these kind of artistic images, pornographic images, which reveal the body in the same way. And obviously, I don't need to explain that in too much detail. So I just wanted to maybe go to Patty and find out is pornography and art still this? Is it a sign of freedom, or is it equally repressive?
No, I don't think it's repressive at all. I think that, for me, I do think a lot of it's quite, self-determining. And this is sort of what I was just talking with Hans about earlier. This idea that, if you want women to have full equal rights as everybody else, you have to give them their own mind to decide whether or not they want that boob job. It's, I think that it's absolutely, completely self-determining. But I find perhaps possibly the most pornographic, I was having a really good think about the most pornographic artworks that I've seen. And they tend to be from the really repressive places where they can't actually be explicit at all. So if you think of things like, I won't even name the artist, there's some Iranian artists that I know who are, whose work is like the most tame, benign, but if you actually start to read between the cracks of it, you realize like how absolutely repressed that is, because it's the only way that they can actually express themselves. That tempers on porn, but that's not necessarily porn. That does something else. Porn is not its function. But you start to realize, like, it's been a long time since I've ever actually been able to look at images as being risque in any way. And I think that's probably the closest anything's come. Like, if you even think in Western culture, the most porn thing, there are very few cultural taboos left, whether it's, scatology or, pedophilia or something like that, where even that's not shocking anymore. I mean, it's just become so, I don't know what becomes shocking. It's almost like the most anti-shocking thing would be shocking.
Martin, what do you feel on that one?
Well, you talked about the freedom we have, which is obviously relative rather than absolute, but just as a footnote to this discussion before we open it up, we couldn't even begin to consider the Seduce the Art and Sex exhibition at the Barbican going to an American privately funded or publicly funded art gallery. And that's an interesting reality, which, and of course Mapplethorpe, we know the difficulty he ran into. In the Barbican show, we had one of his photographs, a gay guy with a whip up his ass. That in the context of American funding of public galleries is probably not a runner.
But recently opened in Bexhill on Sea.
No,
Well, just
they loved it. Sorry.
On that note, the exhibition where that photograph was originally shown was funded by the American Public Funding Agency and created a controversy in such a way that the gallery pulled out and didn't show these pictures anymore.
30 years ago at
Yes, it's
least.
a long
I mean,
time
like,
ago.
morality is like changed. I mean, it's beyond the living memory of half the people here. I mean, it's not now.
But it is
And
now-
thank God those debates happen, so we
Well,
can
it
get
is
to
now in
this
America,
point,
and you get exactly the same reaction.
but America's also one of the most, I guess, repressive places as well.
Okay, shall we open it up to the audience? Does anyone have any questions, perchance?